The carriage had not even come to a full stop when the front doors of Ashford Manor burst open, and a small boy came running down the stone steps 2 at a time. Claire's heart lifted at the sight of him. This was the moment she had imagined for weeks, ever since Edmund had told her that his son Julian would be waiting to greet her on the day she arrived as his new wife. She stepped down from the carriage, smoothed her traveling coat, and knelt slightly, opening her arms toward the boy. But Julian did not run to her. He ran past her, past the outstretched arms, past the hopeful smile on her face, and threw himself instead into the arms of a young woman standing near the servants' entrance. The woman caught him easily, as though this was something she had done 1,000 times before, and lifted him onto her hip the way a mother might. Her apron was worn soft from years of washing, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and her name, Claire would soon learn, was Nora. For a moment, nobody moved. The coachman busied himself with the trunks. A groom looked away and pretended to check the horses' harnesses. Even the butler, a tall and composed man named Mr. Whitmore, cleared his throat and glanced toward the ground, as if the gravel path had suddenly become very interesting. Claire remained kneeling there, her arms still slightly open, her smile frozen in place, before it slowly faded. She could feel the eyes of the household on her, could feel the silence pressing down like a heavy blanket. She was the new Duchess of Ashford. She had traveled 3 days to reach this house, and in the span of 5 seconds, she had been overlooked by a 6-year-old boy in favor of the maid. She rose to her feet, brushing invisible dust from her skirts, and forced her voice to remain light. "He must be shy," she said, though no one had asked. "Children often are, around new faces." Edmund, who had been speaking with the driver about the luggage, turned just in time to see the tail end of the scene. He frowned slightly, more out of confusion than concern, and walked toward his son. "Julian," he said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of a father, "come and greet your new mother." Julian buried his face deeper into Nora's shoulder and did not answer. "He is only tired from his lessons," Nora said quickly, her voice soft but steady. She kept her eyes down, not meeting the Duke's gaze directly, as was proper for a servant addressing her employer. "I will bring him inside and settle him, Your Grace. He will greet the Duchess properly once he has rested." Edmund nodded, satisfied with this explanation, and turned back to Claire with an apologetic smile. "Forgive him. He has always been a quiet boy. Come, let me show you the house." Claire took her husband's offered arm, but her eyes lingered a moment longer on the boy's small hand gripping the fabric of the maid's dress, and on the maid's arm wrapped protectively around him, the way a wing might wrap around a chick. There was something in that image that unsettled her, though she could not yet say what it was. The manor itself was beautiful beyond anything she had imagined. Tall windows lined the hallways, filling the rooms with soft afternoon light. Portraits of previous dukes and duchesses hung along the grand staircase, their painted eyes seeming to follow her as she passed. Edmund walked her through room after room, naming them with the ease of a man who had grown up within these walls, pointing out the library, the music room, the long gallery where his mother once held her afternoon teas. "And this," he said, pausing before a closed door near the end of the east wing, "was my late wife's sitting room. I have left it as it was. I hope, in time, you might make it your own." Claire studied the door for a long moment. She knew, of course, that Edmund had been married before, and that his first wife, Margaret, had died 2 years earlier after a long illness. She knew that Julian had been only 4 years old at the time, too young to fully understand the loss, but old enough to feel the absence of her presence in every corner of the house. What she had not fully understood, until this very afternoon, was how deeply that absence had been filled by someone else. "Of course," she said gently, "whenever you feel ready to open it." Edmund gave her a grateful look, one that told her he appreciated her patience more than he could express in words. They continued down the hallway, and as they turned a corner, Claire caught a glimpse through a window, overlooking the garden below. Julian was there, running along the garden path with Nora close behind him, laughing as she pretended not to be able to catch him. The sound of the boy's laughter carried faintly through the glass, bright and unguarded in a way it had not been near his father or near her. Claire paused at the window, watching the scene unfold below. Nora scooped Julian up when she finally caught him, spinning him once before setting him down again, and the boy wrapped his arms around her neck and rested his head against her shoulder, utterly at ease. They seem close, Claire said carefully, keeping her tone light. Edmund glanced out the window and smiled, though there was a distracted quality to it, as if he were only half paying attention. Nora has been with us for years. She helped a great deal after Margaret passed. Julian is fond of her. Fond felt like too small a word for what Claire had just witnessed, but she did not press the matter, not yet. She reminded herself that she had only just arrived, that first impressions could be misleading, and that children often needed time to adjust to change. She told herself this several times as they continued the tour, repeating it in her mind like a quiet promise, though a small uneasy feeling had settled in her chest and refused to leave. That evening, dinner was a quiet affair. Edmund spoke of estate matters, of tenants and harvests, and a bridge that needed repair before winter, and Claire listened attentively, asking questions where she could, trying to learn the rhythms of this new life she had entered. Julian was not present at the table. When she asked about him, Edmund explained simply that the boy took his supper earlier, in the nursery, as he always had. "Does he not dine with you?" Claire asked. "Not since Margaret passed," Edmund admitted. "It seemed easier for him. The dining room reminded him too much of her, I think. Nora brings his meals to the nursery instead." Claire nodded, filing this piece of information away with the others she had gathered that day. Each detail seemed small on its own, easily explained, easily forgiven, but together, they were beginning to form a picture, one she did not yet fully understand, but could feel taking shape at the edges of her mind, like a shadow growing longer as the sun set. After dinner, Edmund excused himself to his study, promising to join her shortly, and Claire found herself alone in the long gallery, studying the portraits of the family she had married into. She stopped before one in particular, a painting of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, holding an infant in her arms. A small brass plate beneath the frame read Margaret, Duchess of Ashford. She stood there for a long while, studying the woman's face, wondering what kind of mother she had been, what kind of bond she had shared with her son before illness took her away. She wondered, too, what promises might have been made in those final days, what words might have been spoken between a dying mother and the people she trusted most to care for her child. A soft sound behind her made her turn. It was Nora, carrying a small tray with an empty cup and saucer, likely returning from settling Julian for the night. The maid startled slightly upon seeing the Duchess standing there, and quickly lowered her eyes, dropping into a small curtsy. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I did not mean to disturb you." "You are not disturbing me," Claire said, studying the young woman more closely now that they stood face to face. Nora could not have been older than 25, with dark hair pulled back neatly, and eyes that held a quiet wariness, the look of someone accustomed to being careful in every word and gesture. "Is Julian settled for the night?" "Yes, Your Grace. He is asleep." "Does he sleep easily?" Nora hesitated, just slightly, before answering. "Most nights, yes. He can be restless if the house is unfamiliar, but he knows this house well. He should sleep soundly tonight." There was something practiced in the answer, something that told Claire this was not the first time Nora had been asked such questions, though perhaps never before by a duchess. Claire studied her a moment longer, searching for something she could not quite name, before offering a small, polite smile. "Thank you, Nora. That will be all." The maid curtsied again and continued down the hallway, her footsteps soft against the polished floor, until she disappeared around the corner. Claire remained standing before the portrait a while longer, her thoughts turning over the events of the day like stones in a riverbed, each one worn smooth by the weight of what she did not yet know. She thought of Julian running past her outstretched arms. She thought of the ease with which he had settled into Nora's embrace, an ease that spoke of years, not months. She thought of the closed door to Margaret's sitting room, and of Edmund's distracted smile, as he watched his son laugh in the garden below with someone who was not his wife. She was not a jealous woman by nature. She had come into this marriage with open eyes, knowing that Edmund carried grief and history that she could not erase, and she had told herself she would be patient, that she would earn Julian's trust in time, that children needed patience above all else. But patience, she was beginning to realize, might not be enough if the bond she needed to break through had already hardened into something far stronger than mere habit. Later that night, as she prepared for bed in the grand chamber that was now hers, she found herself standing at the window, looking out over the moonlit garden, where Julian and Nora had played earlier that day. The garden was empty now, quiet. The flowers closed for the night, but she could still hear, in her memory, the sound of the boys' unguarded laughter. She wondered how long it would take before that laughter belonged to her as well. She did not know, standing there in the quiet dark of her new home, that the answer to that question would take her down a path far more complicated than she could have imagined. One that would force her to question everything she thought she understood, about family, about loyalty, and about the quiet sacrifices made by those who serve. She did not know that the maid she had just spoken to in the hallway held secrets that stretched back years, secrets tied to promises made beside a dying woman's bed. She did not know that her husband, for all his love and good intentions, had been blind to something happening under his own roof for far longer than he realized. All she knew, as she finally climbed into bed and closed her eyes, was that her first day as the Duchess of Ashford had not gone as she had hoped, and that tomorrow she intended to understand why. Sleep did not come easily. The unfamiliar sounds of the old house settled around her, the creak of wood cooling after the day's warmth, the distant call of an owl somewhere beyond the garden wall, and beneath it all, the quiet, persistent thought that she had married into more than a title and a household. She had married into a story that had already begun long before she arrived, one with its own characters and its own quiet loyalties, and she was only now beginning to read the first page. Morning came softly through the tall windows of Claire's chamber, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then the memory of the previous day returned, sharp and unwelcome, and she lay still for a long while before rising. She dressed carefully, choosing a soft blue gown that Edmund had once said suited her well, and made her way down to the breakfast room, determined that today would go differently. Edmund was already seated when she arrived, a newspaper folded beside his plate, a cup of tea steaming in front of him. He rose when she entered, pulling out her chair with the easy courtesy that had first drawn her to him during their courtship in the city, months before either of them had imagined this house, this title, or this quiet tangle of grief and loyalty waiting for her within its walls. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, settling back into his seat. "Well enough," she said, though it was not entirely true. "The house is very grand. I imagine it will take time to learn my way around it." "You will manage it beautifully, I have no doubt," Edmund said, smiling at her with genuine warmth. He reached for his tea, then paused, glancing toward the doorway as though a thought had just occurred to him. "I should have Julian join us for breakfast this morning. It is not right that you have not yet spoken with him properly." Claire's stomach tightened at the memory of the previous afternoon, but she kept her expression pleasant. "That would be lovely." Edmund called for Mr. Whitmore, who appeared within moments, and requested that Julian be brought down. There was a pause, longer than Claire expected, before the butler returned, alone. "Forgive me, Your Grace," Mr. Whitmore said carefully. "The young master is already at his breakfast in the nursery. Nora is with him." Something flickered across Edmund's face, a brief crease of frustration quickly smoothed away. "Then have them both come down. It is time Julian took his meals with the family, as any young gentleman should." Mr. Whitmore hesitated only a moment, before nodding and withdrawing. Claire watched her husband carefully, noting the small furrow that remained between his brows, even after the butler had gone. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "No, nothing," Edmund said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "It is only that Julian has grown rather accustomed to his own routines these past 2 years. I have allowed it, I suppose, because it seemed easier at the time. But he is 6 now, old enough to begin joining us properly." Claire said nothing, though she wondered privately how much of that routine had been shaped not by what was easiest for a grieving child, but by what had simply gone unquestioned for far too long. Grief, she knew, could excuse a great deal, but it could also become a habit that outlived its original purpose, settling into the walls of a house, until no one remembered to ask whether it was still needed. A few minutes later, the door opened, and Julian appeared, his small hand tucked into Nora's. He wore a neat little suit, his hair combed, his shoes polished, the picture of a well-cared-for child. But the moment his eyes landed on Claire, his expression shuddered, and he stepped slightly behind Nora, as though seeking cover. "Good morning, Julian," Claire said gently, keeping her voice warm and unhurried. "I am glad to see you this morning." Julian did not answer. He looked instead toward his father, then back toward Nora, his small fingers tightening around the maid's hand. "Julian," Edmund said, his tone patient but firm, "greet your new mother properly." She is not my mother, Julian said quietly, though clearly enough for everyone in the room to hear. The words landed like a small stone, dropped into still water, sending ripples through the silence that followed. Claire felt her cheeks warm, though she kept her composure, reminding herself that the boy was young, that grief spoke through children in ways they themselves did not fully understand. "Julian!" Edmund said again, sharper this time. "That is not how we speak to the Duchess." "It is all right," Claire said quickly, before the moment could sour further. "He is only being honest. I do not wish to replace anyone, Julian. I only hope, in time, we might become friends." The boy studied her for a moment, his young face unreadable, before looking up at Nora as though for guidance. Nora, for her part, kept her eyes carefully lowered, though Claire noticed the way her hand gave the boy's fingers a small, reassuring squeeze. "Come, Julian, sit with your father," Nora said softly. "I will wait outside." "No," Julian said quickly, his voice rising with something close to panic. "Stay. Please stay." Edmund's frown deepened. "Nora may remain a moment, if it helps him settle," he said, though there was a weariness in his tone that suggested this was not the first time such an arrangement had been made. Nora curtsied and took a seat slightly apart from the table, near the wall, in the manner of a servant present but not participating, though Julian's eyes returned to her every few moments as though checking that she had not left. Breakfast proceeded awkwardly. Edmund tried to draw his son into conversation, asking about his lessons, his latest book, the wooden horse he had been carving with the estate carpenter's help. Julian answered in short, polite sentences, his gaze flicking often toward Nora, who sat quietly with her hands folded in her lap, watching the boy with the careful attentiveness of someone accustomed to reading his moods before he expressed them himself. Claire tried, gently, to join the conversation. She asked Julian about his favorite part of the garden, complimented the wooden horse he described, offered a small story from her own childhood about a pony she had once loved. Julian listened politely enough, even offered a small smile at one point, but the warmth she hoped to build did not quite take hold. It was clear, painfully clear, that his trust belonged elsewhere. After breakfast, Edmund excused himself to meet with his steward about the estate's autumn accounts, leaving Claire alone in the breakfast room, as Nora led Julian back toward the nursery. Claire remained seated for a long moment, staring at the food on her plate that she had barely touched, feeling the quiet weight of humiliation settle over her once more. She had known, coming into this marriage, that she would not be Julian's mother in the way Margaret had been. She had accepted that a mother's place could never truly be replaced, only added to, in time, with patience and care. But what she had not expected was the sharp, immediate exclusion she felt in this house, the sense that a role she hoped to grow into had already been filled by someone else entirely, someone whose position in the household was meant to be far smaller than the one she now clearly occupied in the boy's heart. She rose from the table and walked slowly through the halls, past the portraits of dukes and duchesses long since passed, until she found herself once more before the closed door of Margaret's old sitting room. She paused there, resting her hand lightly against the polished wood, wondering what answers might lie behind it, what letters or diaries or quiet instructions the late Duchess might have left behind before her death. She did not try the handle. It was too soon, she told herself, too soon to intrude on grief that was not fully hers to disturb. But the thought lingered, quiet and persistent, that somewhere in this house, answers existed to the questions now forming in her mind, and that she would need to find them if she hoped to understand the true shape of the family she had married into. Later that afternoon, she sought out Mrs. Dobson, the housekeeper, a stout, no-nonsense woman who had served the Ashford family for over 20 years, and who Claire suspected knew more about the household's inner workings than anyone else beneath its roof. She found her in the linen room, counting sheets with brisk efficiency. "Mrs. Dobson," Claire said, closing the door softly behind her. "Might I ask you something? In confidence?" The housekeeper set down her ledger, studying the new Duchess with an expression that was neither unkind nor entirely warm, the careful neutrality of a woman who had learned long ago the wisdom of staying out of family matters.
"Of course, Your Grace."
"Nora," Claire said carefully, "how long has she served this family?" Mrs. Dobson's expression shifted, just slightly, a flicker of something that might have been caution. "Nora has been with us since before the young master was born, Your Grace. She came as a girl herself, barely 16, to assist the late Duchess. And after the Duchess passed, she remained, Your Grace. The late Duke, that is, the current Duke's father, God rest him, had always kept the household running smoothly, and when the young Duchess fell ill, it was Nora who cared for young Julian most closely, as the mistress grew weaker. She was there at the end, in the sick room, more often than anyone else, I believe. Claire absorbed this information slowly, feeling the shape of the story growing clearer, though still incomplete, like a portrait glimpsed through fog. Was there ever any arrangement made? Any promise regarding Julian's care? Mrs. Dobson's eyes flickered toward the door, as though checking that no one else could hear, before she answered, her voice lower now. I could not say for certain, Your Grace. Such matters were private, between the Duchess and those closest to her in her final days. But I will say this, whatever passed between them, Nora has honored it faithfully, more faithfully perhaps than anyone expected of a servant her age. She has given that boy more steady care these past 2 years than most mothers give in a lifetime, if I may speak plainly. There was no judgment in the housekeeper's words, only a quiet, weary honesty, and Claire found herself grateful for it, even as it deepened the unease settling in her chest. She thanked Mrs. Dobson and left the linen room, walking slowly back toward her own chamber, turning the housekeeper's words over in her mind. Whatever passed between them, a promise, perhaps, made beside a deathbed, from one woman to another, entrusting a child's heart to someone who was not his mother by blood, but who had earned that title through years of quiet, unglamorous devotion. It was, Claire realized, a story far larger and far more complicated than simple jealousy could explain, and she felt the first stirrings of something other than hurt pride settle into her thinking. Curiosity, perhaps. Even, though she was reluctant yet to admit it, a grudging respect for a woman who had given so much to a child that was not hers. But respect did not erase the ache of being pushed aside in her own home, nor the growing worry that Edmund himself did not fully understand what had taken root beneath his roof in his absence, both physical and emotional, over these past 2 years of grief. She resolved, as she reached her chamber and closed the door softly behind her, that she would need to understand this story fully before she could hope to find her own place within it. And that understanding, she suspected, would require more patience and more courage than she had first imagined this marriage would demand of her. That evening, from her window, she watched once more as Julian played in the garden below, this time with a small wooden horse in hand, running it along the top of the low garden wall, while Nora watched from a nearby bench, mending a small tear in his jacket with quick, practiced stitches. The scene held a quiet, ordinary tenderness that Claire found she could not resent, no matter how hard she tried, and that troubled her more than outright hostility might have. It was difficult to be angry at kindness. It was far harder still to know how to compete with it. Over the following days, Claire tried a gentler approach. She had decided, after much thought, that pressing too hard would only push Julian further away, and that patience, however difficult, was the only path likely to succeed. She began small, arriving in the nursery one morning with a simple wooden puzzle she had found tucked away in a storage room, its pieces depicting a map of distant lands with painted ships and curling waves. I thought you might enjoy this, she said, setting it carefully on the small table where Julian sat with his breakfast. I used to solve puzzles like this myself when I was young. It helped me learn my geography, though I confess I was terrible at it for the longest time. Julian eyed the puzzle with cautious interest, though he said nothing at first. Nora, standing nearby folding a small stack of clean clothes, glanced at Claire with something that might have been surprise, quickly hidden behind her usual composed expression. You may keep it in the nursery, Claire added, or bring it wherever you like. It is yours now. Thank you, Julian said quietly, though he did not look up from the puzzle pieces he had begun sorting by color. It was not much, but it was something, and Claire took what small comfort she could from it as she left the nursery that morning. She began repeating such small gestures over the following days, careful never to overwhelm the boy, never to insist on more closeness than he was willing to give. She brought a picture book one afternoon, a collection of stories about brave sailors and distant kingdoms. Another day, she suggested a walk through the eastern part of the garden, where she had noticed a small pond full of colorful fish that Julian seemed fond of watching. He accepted these offerings politely, sometimes even with the beginnings of genuine interest, but always with a certain careful distance, as though he were testing the ground before stepping fully onto it. And always, whenever the moment grew slightly too close, slightly too warm, his eyes would drift toward the doorway, searching for Nora, and would not settle again until he had found her. It was during one such walk through the garden, a bright afternoon with a cool breeze moving through the hedges, that Claire finally understood the depth of what she was working against. Julian had been walking beside her, pointing out the fish in the pond with growing enthusiasm, when he suddenly stumbled slightly on a loose stone and scraped his knee against the garden path. He did not cry out loudly, being a proud sort of boy even at 6 years old, but his small face crumpled with the sudden sting of pain, and his eyes immediately welled with tears. Claire knelt beside him at once, reaching to examine the scrape, murmuring soft reassurances the way any concerned parent might. "Let me see. It is all right. We will clean it up, and it will feel better soon." But Julian pulled back from her hands, his lower lip trembling, and turned instead toward the manor, calling out in a small, desperate voice, "Nora, Nora, I am hurt." The maid appeared within moments, having been nearby tending to the kitchen garden, and rushed forward, kneeling beside the boy and gathering him gently into her arms. "There now, let me see," she said softly, examining the small scrape with practiced, gentle hands. "It is only a small scratch, my darling. You are very brave. We will clean it and put on a bandage, and you will be running about again before supper." Julian nodded, his tears already slowing, comforted entirely by Nora's presence, in a way that Claire's own attempts at comfort had failed to achieve. Claire remained kneeling on the garden path, her hands still slightly outstretched from her aborted attempt to help, watching the scene unfold with an ache in her chest that she could not fully name. It was not anger, precisely, though frustration was certainly part of it. It was something closer to grief, she realized, a mourning for a role she had hoped to fill, and now understood she could not simply step into by force of will alone. Whatever bond existed between Julian and Nora had been built over years of small moments, exactly like this one. Moments of comfort, offered and received, of trust, earned through countless repetitions of care, given freely and without condition. It was not something that could be replaced with a puzzle or a picture book, however well-intentioned. She rose slowly, brushing the dirt from her knees, and watched as Nora carried Julian back toward the house, murmuring softly to him the entire way, his small arms wrapped around her neck, his face buried against her shoulder. Neither of them looked back. That evening, Claire found Edmund in his study, poring over correspondence from one of the tenant farmers regarding a dispute over grazing rights. She waited until he had set the letter aside before speaking. "Edmund," she said carefully, "I wonder if we might speak about Julian." He looked up, setting down his pen with the attentive expression he always gave her, though a faint weariness lingered around his eyes from the long day's work. "Of course. Is something troubling you?" Claire chose her words with care, not wishing to sound accusatory, nor to diminish the genuine care Nora had clearly given the boy. "I have been trying, these past days, to grow closer to him, and I believe he is beginning to warm to me, slowly. But I confess I am uncertain how to proceed, given how deeply attached he is to Nora." Edmund's expression grew thoughtful, and he leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "I have not thought of it carefully enough myself, I admit. After Margaret passed, I was not, if I am honest, in any state to attend closely to Julian's daily needs. Nora simply stepped in, and it seemed a mercy at the time, a kindness I was grateful for, and did not examine too closely." "And now?" Claire asked gently. Edmund was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the window, where the last light of evening was fading over the garden. "Now I wonder if I allowed a kindness to become something else entirely, without noticing the change. I do not wish to cause Julian pain by disrupting something that has clearly given him comfort these past years, but I also do not wish for you to feel as though you have married into a family where your place has already been claimed by another." "I do not wish to remove Nora from his life," Claire said quickly, surprising herself slightly with the certainty in her own voice. "Whatever else I feel, I can see plainly that she loves him, and that he needs her. I only wish to understand my own place in all of this. I do not know how to be his stepmother if there is no room left for me to occupy." Edmund reached across the desk and took her hand, his expression softening with something that looked like genuine gratitude. "You are kinder than I deserve, to think of it this way rather than simply demanding her dismissal, as many in your position might." "Would that truly help Julian?" Claire asked. "Or would it only take away the one steady thing he has held on to since his mother died?" Edmund did not answer immediately, and Claire understood, watching the conflict play across his face, that he had never truly considered the question in such terms before. He had accepted Nora's role in his son's life as a simple, practical arrangement, born of necessity during a difficult time, without ever fully examining what that arrangement had grown into, or what it might mean going forward now that circumstances in the house had changed once more. "I will think on it," he said finally. "Perhaps I have been too distant these past years, in more ways than one. Perhaps it is time I paid closer attention, not only to Julian, but to the household as a whole." Claire nodded, satisfied for the moment with this small acknowledgement, though she sensed that the true answers she sought would not come from her husband, distracted as he had been by grief and duty, but from somewhere else entirely. Perhaps from Nora herself, if the maid could ever be persuaded to speak openly. Perhaps from the closed door of Margaret's old sitting room, which Claire found herself thinking about more and more often as the days passed, wondering what secrets it might hold, what letters or instructions the late Duchess might have left behind before her death, that could explain the depth of devotion Nora showed toward a child that was not, in any legal sense, her own to raise. She left Edmund's study that night with more questions than answers, but also with a growing sense of resolve. She would not fight Nora for Julian's affection, not directly, not through petty competition or demands for dismissal. Instead, she would seek to understand the story that had unfolded in this house before her arrival, and only then would she know how best to find her own place within it, not as a replacement for anyone, but as something new entirely, built patiently, moment by moment, the same way Nora's bond with the boy had been built, years before Claire had ever arrived to disturb its quiet, settled peace. A fortnight after Claire's arrival, Ashford Manor prepared to host its first gathering since her marriage, a modest dinner for several neighboring families and a few of Edmund's oldest friends, meant partly as a celebration of the new Duchess and partly as an opportunity for the local gentry to take her measure. Claire spent the morning overseeing preparations with Mrs. Dobson, arranging flowers, reviewing the menu, and ensuring the good silver had been polished to a proper shine, grateful for the distraction of practical tasks after so many uncertain days. Edmund had insisted, gently but firmly, that Julian join them for at least a short while before being sent up to bed, wanting his son introduced to the guests as a proper young gentleman of the house. Claire had agreed readily enough, hoping that a formal occasion, with its clear expectations of behavior, might provide a natural opportunity for Julian to stand beside her, without the complicated undercurrents that colored their private interactions. The guests began arriving as the afternoon light softened into evening, and Claire found herself greeting neighbors she had not yet met, accepting their polite congratulations with practiced grace, all while keeping half an eye on the doorway, watching for Julian's arrival. When he finally appeared, dressed in a small formal suit that made him look older than his 6 years, he walked in holding Nora's hand, the maid, dressed neatly in her usual dark uniform, clearly intending only to deliver the boy before retreating to the servants' quarters for the remainder of the evening. "There he is," Edmund said warmly, drawing several of the guests' attention. "Come, Julian, greet our friends." The boy performed admirably at first, offering small polite bows to the older gentleman, and curtsies were not expected of him, but a solemn handshake here and there, the picture of a well-trained young heir. Several of the ladies present cooed over his manners, remarking on how much he resembled his late mother, comments that Claire noticed made Edmund's jaw tighten slightly, though he covered it well with practiced social ease. It was going well, better than Claire had dared hope, until Lady Pemberton, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and sharper opinions, turned her attention directly to Julian with the particular bluntness that often came with age and social standing. "And what do you think of your new mother, young man?" she asked, not unkindly, but with the sort of direct curiosity that assumed a child's honest answer would be charming. Julian's face went carefully blank, the same shuttered expression Claire had come to recognize over the past 2 weeks. He glanced first at his father, then, almost involuntarily, toward the doorway where Nora had paused, waiting to be dismissed, clearly hoping to slip away unnoticed before the conversation turned toward her presence. "She is very nice," Julian said finally, his voice small but polite, the answer of a child who had been coached, perhaps not in words but in careful observation of what pleased the adults around him. But then, perhaps sensing an opening, or perhaps simply speaking with the unfiltered honesty of a young child unaccustomed to social pretense, he added, "But Nora is my real family." The room did not go silent exactly, for polite conversation continued around them, but those close enough to hear the exchange exchanged quick, uncomfortable glances. Lady Pemberton's eyebrows rose with obvious interest, the sort of interest that Claire knew would fuel gossip among the local gentry for weeks to come. Edmund's smile grew fixed, his hand tightening slightly, where it rested on the back of a nearby chair. "Julian?" he said quietly, a note of warning in his tone that the boy clearly recognized, for his lower lip trembled slightly, caught between the honesty of his feelings and the sudden awareness that he had somehow said something wrong. "It is quite all right," Claire said quickly, forcing a light laugh that she hoped sounded natural rather than strained. "Children speak so plainly, do they not? It is rather refreshing, compared to the careful diplomacy the rest of us practice." Lady Pemberton chuckled, apparently satisfied by this graceful deflection, and the conversation moved on to other topics, but Claire noticed Edmund's continued discomfort, the way his eyes tracked toward Nora in the doorway, who had gone quite still, her face pale with the realization of what her presence, however innocent her intentions, had just caused. "Nora, you may take Julian up now," Edmund said, his voice tighter than before. "It grows late for him." Nora curtsied quickly and crossed the room, taking Julian's hand and leading him away, with visible relief at the chance to escape further scrutiny. Claire watched them go, noting the way Julian glanced back once, his small face troubled, as though he understood, in the vague way children sometimes understand adult tensions without fully grasping their cause, that something had gone wrong, and that he might somehow be responsible for it. The remainder of the evening passed pleasantly enough on the surface, the guests enjoying an excellent dinner and lively conversation, but Claire felt the weight of the earlier exchange lingering beneath every polite smile she offered, and she suspected Edmund felt it too, given the slight stiffness that had entered his manner for the rest of the night. After the last guests had departed and the house had settled into its late evening quiet, Claire found Edmund standing alone in the entrance hall, staring up at the portrait of his late father that hung near the base of the grand staircase, lost in thought. "That was difficult," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. "It was embarrassing," Edmund said, his voice low and frustrated, though Claire could not tell whether the frustration was directed at Julian, at Nora, at himself, or at the situation as a whole. "My own son, declaring in front of half the county that a servant is his real family. Do you understand how that sounds? How it will be spoken of, in drawing rooms across the district, for weeks to come?" "He is a child," Claire said gently. "He does not understand how his words might be perceived by adults concerned with reputation and standing. He only knows what feels true to him." "And what feels true to him," Edmund said, "is apparently that a maid holds more claim to his heart than either his father or his new mother. That is not a small matter, Claire. That is a problem I have allowed to grow, through my own inattention, into something that now embarrasses this family in public." Claire studied her husband carefully, seeing for the first time genuine distress beneath his usual composed exterior, distress that seemed to stem not merely from social embarrassment, but from a dawning recognition of his own failures as a father these past 2 years. "What will you do?" she asked. Edmund was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he considered the question. "I do not know," he admitted finally. "Perhaps it is time Nora's role in this household was reconsidered. Perhaps she has been given too much liberty, too much closeness to my son, and it has created an unhealthy attachment that must now be corrected before it causes further embarrassment, or worse, further confusion for Julian himself as he grows older." A cold unease settled in Claire's chest at these words, though she could not entirely say why. Perhaps it was the memory of Nora's gentle patience with Julian's scraped knee in the garden. Perhaps it was Mrs. Dobson's careful words about promises made beside a deathbed. Whatever the cause, she found herself speaking, before she had fully considered her words. "Edmund, I do not think dismissing Nora would solve anything. I think it would only take away the one steady comfort Julian has held on to since his mother's death, and replace it with nothing but confusion and further grief. Whatever tonight's embarrassment, I do not believe punishing a maid for loving your son too well is the answer. Edmund looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, surprise mixed with something like relief, though his frustration had not entirely faded. You would defend her? Even after what happened tonight, even after everything you yourself have endured these past weeks, watching him run to her instead of you? I do not defend the embarrassment, Claire said carefully. But I do not believe the boy meant any cruelty by his words, and I do not believe Nora encouraged them either. I believe we are looking at the result of 2 years of grief and absence, mine included, since I was not here to help shoulder that burden, and I do not think the answer lies in removing the person who did step in, simply because her devotion has grown deeper than any of us anticipated. Edmund said nothing for a long moment, studying her with an expression that suggested he was reconsidering something he had believed settled only minutes before. Finally he sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of weary uncertainty Claire had not seen from him before. I do not know what the right course is, he admitted. I only know that something must change, for all our sakes, including Julian's, but I will consider your words before I act rashly. It was not the resolution Claire had hoped for, precisely, but it was something. A small crack of uncertainty in what had moments before seemed like a decision already made. She resolved, as they climbed the stairs together toward their separate chambers that night, that she would need to act soon, and carefully, if she hoped to prevent a rash decision from undoing whatever fragile stability Julian had managed to hold on to these past difficult years. Stability that she now understood, more clearly than ever, rested almost entirely in the steady, quiet devotion of a young maid who had given far more to this family than her position had ever required of her. News of a household's troubles has a way of traveling through servants' quarters faster than any formal announcement, and by the following morning, it seemed the entire staff of Ashford Manor had learned that the Duke was considering some change regarding Nora's position. Claire noticed it first in small ways, a certain hush that fell when she entered rooms where servants had been speaking quietly among themselves, a wariness in the eyes of the younger maids when they passed her in the halls, as though uncertain whether she was the cause of the trouble or merely caught within it. She found Nora in the small laundry room off the kitchen that afternoon, her hands moving through a basin of soapy water with mechanical efficiency, though her shoulders were tense in a way that suggested her mind was far from the task at hand. Claire hesitated in the doorway a moment before entering, uncertain how to begin a conversation she suspected neither of them particularly wanted to have. "Nora," she said finally, and the young woman startled, water splashing slightly over the edge of the basin as she turned. "Your Grace, forgive me. I did not hear you approach." Nora dried her hands quickly on her apron and dropped into a small curtsy, her eyes carefully lowered in the manner expected of a servant, though Claire noticed the faint redness around them, the telltale signs of recent tears carefully composed away. "Please, there is no need for such formality between us. Not in private," Claire said, though she recognized even as she spoke the words how strange they must sound, coming from the very woman whose position in the household might soon displace Nora's own hard-won place in Julian's heart. "I wish to speak with you, if you have a moment." Nora's expression grew guarded, though she nodded. "Of course, Your Grace. I understand there has been talk," Claire said carefully, "regarding your position here. I wanted you to hear, directly from me, that I have not requested any such change, and that I have spoken to the Duke against it." Something shifted in Nora's expression, surprise mixed with a wariness that suggested she had not expected such words from the new Duchess. "I do not understand, Your Grace. I would think you might welcome such a change, given how things have been between the young master and myself." "I understand why you might think that," Claire admitted. "I will not pretend these past weeks have been easy for me, watching Julian turn to you instead of myself at every turn. But I do not believe removing you would help him. I believe it would only harm him further, and I have told the Duke as much." Nora studied her for a long moment, her composed servant's expression cracking slightly to reveal something more raw beneath it, a mixture of gratitude and lingering fear. "Thank you, Your Grace. I confess, I have not slept well since I heard the talk. I do not know what would become of Julian if I were sent away suddenly. He has already lost so much." "Will you tell me," Claire asked gently, "how it began? Your closeness with him, I mean." I have heard fragments from the staff, but I would rather hear the truth from you directly, if you are willing to share it. Nora hesitated, glancing toward the doorway as though checking that no one else could overhear, before setting down the cloth she had been holding and taking a slow breath. I came to this house when I was 16, Your Grace, to serve as an undermaid to the late Duchess. She was kind to me, kinder than most mistresses are to servants so young and inexperienced. When she carried Julian, I was often at her side, and when he was born, I helped care for him alongside his nurse, as was expected of the household staff. And when she grew ill? Nora's eyes grew distant, as though looking back across the years, to a time she had perhaps tried not to revisit too often. It happened slowly at first, and then all at once, as illness often does. The Duke was consumed with grief even before she passed, unable to bear watching her decline, and Julian was too young to understand what was happening to his mother. I was the one who remained steady, I suppose, because someone needed to be, and because I had grown fond of the boy, and of her, in my years of service. Mrs. Dobson mentioned something about a promise, Claire said carefully, made in the Duchess's final days. Nora's composure wavered, just slightly, and she looked down at her hands, twisting the damp cloth between her fingers. I should not speak of such private matters, Your Grace. Please, Claire said, her voice gentle but earnest. I do not ask to cause trouble, or to use it against you. I ask because I am trying to understand my own place in this family, and I cannot do that without understanding what came before me. Nora was quiet for a long moment, weighing something in her mind, before finally nodding slowly. The Duchess called me to her side, near the end, when she knew she had not much time left. She was too weak by then to hold Julian herself, and it broke her heart, I think, more than the illness itself, to know she could not comfort her own son in his final memories of her. She asked me, that day, to promise I would care for him, truly care for him, not simply as a servant performing duties, but as someone who loved him, for as long as he needed it. She said she could not rest easy otherwise. Claire felt something tighten in her throat at these words, an unexpected wave of sympathy for a woman she had never known, dying with the fear that her own son would grow up without anyone to hold him close in the way a mother should. And you promised her this. I did, Nora said simply. And I have tried to keep that promise every day since, Your Grace. Not because it is my duty as a servant, though I know some might see it that way, but because I came to love him myself, in those years of caring for him. He is not simply a task to me. He is a child I have watched grow from his very first days, and I could not turn away from him now, even if my position required it. The two women sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the story settling between them, and Claire found that whatever resentment she had carried these past weeks had softened considerably, replaced by something closer to understanding, even admiration, for the quiet strength this young woman had shown in honoring a promise that asked far more of her than any servant's contract ever could. I do not wish to take that from him, Claire said finally. Whatever else happens in this house, I do not wish for Julian to lose you, Nora. I only hope, in time, there might be room enough in his heart for both of us. Nora looked up at her with something like surprised gratitude, though a lingering wariness remained, the caution of someone who had learned not to trust kindness too quickly, particularly from those with power over her position and livelihood. That is more generous than I expected, Your Grace, given how difficult these past weeks must have been for you. They have been difficult, Claire admitted, but I do not think difficulty is a reason to act unkindly. I would rather find a way forward that honors what you have given him, while also allowing me the chance to build something of my own with him, in time. They spoke a while longer, more easily now that the first difficult confession had passed between them, and Claire learned more of the small details of Julian's life these past 2 years. His fears of thunderstorms, his fondness for a particular lullaby his mother used to sing, which Nora had learned and continued in her stead, his tendency to grow anxious in unfamiliar situations, unless someone familiar remained close by. Each detail deepened Claire's understanding, not only of the boy she hoped to know better, but of the remarkable devotion the young maid before her had shown in filling a void that no one else in the household had been prepared to fill. That evening, emboldened by the conversation, Claire finally found herself standing once more before the closed door of Margaret's old sitting room. She hesitated only a moment this time, before turning the handle and stepping inside. The room had been kept exactly as its former occupant had left it, dust sheets covering the furniture, the faint scent of old lavender lingering in the air. Claire moved slowly through the space, studying the small personal touches that remained. A shawl draped over a chair, a collection of books stacked neatly on a side table, a writing desk positioned near the window that overlooked the same garden Claire had watched Julian play in so many times these past weeks. On the desk, tucked beneath a small stack of correspondence, she found a single sealed letter, addressed simply to, "My Julian, when he is old enough to understand." Claire's hand hovered over it for a long moment, torn between respect for its clearly intended recipient and her own desperate hope that it might contain answers that could guide her forward. She did not open it. It was not hers to open, she reminded herself firmly, however tempting the possibility of answers might be. Instead, she left it exactly where she had found it, resolving to tell Edmund of its existence, so that he might decide, as Julian's father, when the proper time had come to share it with his son. She left the room quietly, closing the door behind her, carrying with her not the answers she had hoped for, but something perhaps more valuable, a deeper understanding of the quiet, complicated love that had held this family together through its darkest days, and a renewed sense of purpose in finding her own place within it, gently, patiently, without disturbing the foundations that had allowed a grieving child to survive his mother's loss, with his heart still capable of love. Claire told Edmund of the letter that same night, finding him once more in his study, though this time he set aside his work the moment she entered, sensing perhaps from her expression that she carried something important. He listened quietly as she described the sealed envelope, the careful handwriting addressing it to Julian, meant for a day when he was old enough to understand its contents. "She wrote him a letter," Edmund repeated softly, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show so openly. "I did not know. I could not bring myself to go through her things, these past 2 years. I suppose I feared what I might find, or perhaps what I would not find, some final word meant for me that never came. Perhaps there is something for you as well, somewhere among her papers," Claire said gently. "But I did not search further. It did not feel right, without you present." Edmund nodded slowly, staring at his hands for a long moment, before looking up at her with an expression of quiet gratitude. "Thank you, for telling me, and for not opening it yourself. Many would have been tempted. I confess I was tempted," Claire admitted honestly. "But it is not mine to read. It belongs to Julian, when the time is right, and perhaps to you as well, if you wish to prepare him for it eventually." They sat together a while longer, discussing when such a time might come, whether Julian at 6 was far too young for such a weighty inheritance of grief, and whether it might be better to wait until he was older, perhaps 10 or 12, old enough to hold such words with the gravity they deserved without being overwhelmed by them. Edmund seemed relieved to have the decision to make together, rather than shouldering it alone, as he had shouldered so much else these past 2 years. "I have also been thinking further on what you said. Regarding Nora," Edmund admitted after a pause. "I spoke with her myself this afternoon, briefly, and asked her to tell me plainly what her intentions were, going forward, if she remained in this household. And what did she say? She said she wished only to see Julian happy and cared for, and that she would step back from her closeness with him, if that was what I required, though it would grieve her greatly to do so. She did not plead for her own position, only for his well-being." Edmund's expression grew thoughtful. It was not the answer of someone seeking to secure her place through manipulation. It was the answer of someone who genuinely loves him. "Then you will not dismiss her?" "No," Edmund said, with the first real certainty Claire had heard from him on the matter since the dinner party's uncomfortable moment. "I will not. But I do think some changes are needed, gently made, so that Julian learns to depend on more than one person for his comfort, so that his heart has room to grow beyond the walls he has built these past 2 years." Claire felt a genuine relief at this decision, though she knew the path forward would still require patience and care. They spoke a while longer of practical matters, of perhaps having Julian join them for meals more regularly, of small outings the three of them might take together, of ways to slowly widen the circle of trust the boy had drawn so tightly around himself and Nora. It was into this fragile, hopeful moment that trouble arrived only days later, in the form of Edmund's elder sister, Lady Beatrice Ashford Kellerman, who descended upon the manor with little warning and considerably firm opinions about how the household ought to be run. Lady Beatrice had married well and moved to the north years earlier, but she maintained a keen interest in her brother's affairs, particularly where they touched upon the family's reputation and Julian's eventual inheritance. She arrived on a gray afternoon, her carriage rattling up the drive with an urgency that suggested she had traveled with some purpose beyond simple family visitation. Claire greeted her with polite warmth, though she noted immediately the sharp, assessing look Lady Beatrice gave the household staff, and the particular narrowing of her eyes when Julian was mentioned. "I have heard troubling things," Lady Beatrice said, once she and Edmund and Claire were settled in the drawing room, with tea neither of them particularly wanted. "Regarding your household, brother, word has reached me, even so far north, that your son declared a common maid to be his true family, in front of half the county's gentry." Edmund's jaw tightened. "Beatrice, that is not quite how it happened." "I do not care precisely how it happened," Lady Beatrice said briskly. "What matters is how it is being spoken of. Do you understand what such talk does to a family's standing? To Julian's prospects, when he is old enough to be considered for proper society, for a suitable marriage in years to come, people will say the Ashford heir was raised more by servants than by his own family, and such talk, once it takes root, is difficult to uproot." "Julian has suffered a great loss," Claire said carefully, "and the woman who cared for him through that loss deserves gratitude, not suspicion." Lady Beatrice's sharp eyes turned to Claire, with an assessing look that made clear she had not yet decided what to make of her brother's new wife. Gratitude is one thing. Allowing a servant to occupy the position of mother in a future duke's heart is quite another. I would think you, of all people, newly arrived and hoping to establish your own place in this household, would understand the danger in allowing such confusion to continue. "I understand it," Claire said evenly, "which is precisely why I do not believe removing her suddenly would help. It would only replace one form of confusion with another, and cause Julian a fresh grief, on top of the one he has already endured." Lady Beatrice studied her for a long moment, clearly surprised by this measured response, before turning back to her brother. "You have allowed this maid entirely too much liberty, Edmund. I have made inquiries, and I understand she was present, even at Margaret's deathbed, closer perhaps than propriety strictly allows for a servant of her station. I think it would be wise, for the sake of this family's reputation, to see her placed elsewhere, perhaps recommended to another household at some distance from here, where her attachment to Julian might fade naturally over time." "I will not send her away, simply to satisfy gossip," Edmund said firmly, his tone leaving little room for argument, though Claire noticed the slight strain in his voice that suggested his sister's words had touched some private uncertainty he had not entirely resolved. "Then you risk your son's future, standing for the sake of a servant's feelings," Lady Beatrice said sharply. "I had hoped, brother, that your new marriage might bring some order back to this household. I see now that perhaps I hoped for too much, too quickly." The conversation grew tenser still over the following hour, Lady Beatrice pressing her arguments with increasing insistence, invoking concerns of inheritance, of proper upbringing, of the family's standing among their peers, while Edmund grew increasingly defensive, and Claire found herself, unexpectedly, standing firmly at her husband's side in defense of a woman she had, only weeks earlier, viewed as a rival for her stepson's affection. It was only when Julian himself wandered into the drawing room that afternoon, drawn by curiosity at the sound of raised voices, that the tension in the room shifted into something more immediate and alarming. Lady Beatrice's sharp eyes landed on the boy at once, and her expression grew calculating in a way that made Claire's stomach tighten with sudden unease. "Come here, Julian," Lady Beatrice said, her voice softening into a false warmth that did not match the sharpness still lingering in her eyes. "Tell your aunt truthfully. Do you love your new mother, the Duchess, as a son ought to love his mother?" Julian glanced uncertainly toward his father, then toward Claire, clearly sensing the weight expected of his answer, though not fully understanding why it mattered so much to the stern woman asking it. "I like her," he said carefully, a diplomatic answer for a child his age, though it clearly did not satisfy his aunt's purposes. "And do you understand," Lady Beatrice pressed, "that a maid, however kind, can never truly be considered family, in the way a proper mother can?" Claire felt a flash of something close to alarm at the direction this line of questioning was taking, sensing that Lady Beatrice intended to use the boy's own words, extracted under pressure, as ammunition for whatever plan she had already begun forming regarding Nora's dismissal. Beatrice, Edmund said sharply, rising from his chair. That is quite enough. He is a child, not a witness to be questioned for your purposes. Lady Beatrice's expression flickered with brief irritation, before smoothing back into composed politeness. I only wish to understand the household I am visiting, brother. Surely that is not an unreasonable request. But the damage, small as it was, had already been done, and Claire found herself watching Julian's small, confused face, with a growing sense that whatever fragile peace had been building in this household these past days was now under threat from a source none of them had anticipated. A threat that seemed, in its quiet, calculating way, considerably more dangerous than the simple jealousy Claire herself had once felt toward a devoted young maid, trying only to keep a promise made to a dying woman years before. Lady Beatrice remained at Ashford Manor for the better part of a week, and Claire quickly learned that her sister-in-law was not a woman who abandoned a purpose easily once she had settled upon it. Though Edmund had firmly refused her initial demand to dismiss Nora, Lady Beatrice did not retreat from her position, only shifted her approach, growing quieter and more observant, watching the household's rhythms with the patient attention of someone building a case, rather than simply voicing an opinion. Claire noticed her sister-in-law's movements through the house with growing unease, the way she lingered near the nursery at odd hours, the questions she posed to various servants under the guise of idle conversation, always circling back to Nora's conduct, her history, her closeness to Julian. Mrs. Dobson mentioned, in a hushed conversation over the household accounts one morning, that Lady Beatrice had been asking pointed questions about whether any formal record existed of Nora's promotion from under maid to something closer to a governess or nurse, a distinction that carried real weight in matters of household propriety, and, more troublingly, in matters of family reputation, should the arrangement ever be challenged legally. She means to make trouble, Mrs. Dobson said quietly, glancing toward the door, as though fearing Lady Beatrice might appear at any moment. I have served this family many years, Your Grace, and I know the look of someone gathering evidence, rather than simply forming an opinion. Claire's concern deepened considerably when, 4 days into Lady Beatrice's visit, Edmund was called away unexpectedly to attend to a matter regarding one of the estate's distant properties, a dispute over boundary lines that required his presence for at least 2 days' travel. He left reluctantly, promising to return as swiftly as possible, unaware that his absence would provide his sister exactly the opportunity she had been quietly waiting for. The trouble began the very morning after Edmund's departure. Claire had risen early, intending to spend the morning in the garden with Julian, as had become a pleasant new routine between them over the past week, small moments of shared quiet that Claire treasured as fragile but genuine progress. She found the nursery empty, however, and a young undermaid, clearly nervous, informed her that Lady Beatrice had already taken Julian and Nora to the drawing room some 20 minutes earlier. Claire made her way there quickly, a sense of foreboding building with each step, and arrived to find Lady Beatrice seated in a high-backed chair, a stack of papers on the table before her, while Nora stood near the doorway, her face pale and her hands twisted anxiously in her apron, and Julian sat on a small stool nearby, looking frightened and confused by whatever conversation had been unfolding before Claire's arrival. "Ah, Duchess," Lady Beatrice said, her tone pleasant in a way that did nothing to soften the calculating look in her eyes. "I am glad you have joined us. I was just explaining to young Nora here that certain arrangements in this household require proper documentation, and that in my brother's absence, as the senior family member present, I have taken it upon myself to review the household's records." "What is happening here?" Claire asked, keeping her voice level despite the alarm building within her. "I have found," Lady Beatrice continued, tapping the papers before her, "that this young woman has never been formally elevated beyond the position of household maid, despite performing duties, by her own admission, that far exceed such a role for the past 2 years. I have also learned, through some careful inquiry, that certain private matters between her and my late sister-in-law were never properly witnessed or recorded, matters that some might consider rather irregular, given how much influence they seem to have granted a servant over a future duke's upbringing." Claire's stomach tightened with alarm as she understood Lady Beatrice's intent, to frame Nora's devoted care not as an act of love and promise-keeping, but as some kind of improper overreach, a servant who had exceeded her station without proper authorization, a technicality that could be used to justify her dismissal on grounds of impropriety rather than simple family preference, a far more damaging accusation for a young woman with no other family or resources to fall back upon. That is not fair, Claire said firmly. Nora has done nothing improper. She has cared for a grieving child with more devotion than anyone else in this household managed during a difficult time, and she did so at the request of his own mother, on her deathbed. So the maid claims, Lady Beatrice said coolly. Though I notice there is no written record of any such request, only her word, which conveniently cannot be verified now that my sister-in-law is no longer alive to confirm it. Nora's face had gone white, and Claire saw her hands trembling slightly where they gripped her apron. I would never lie about such a thing, Nora said quietly, though her voice wavered with the fear of someone who understood how little power she held in this confrontation. A servant against a titled lady, with the resources and connections to make good on whatever threats she chose to level. Perhaps you would not, Lady Beatrice said, and perhaps you would. I cannot know your heart, only your position, which grants you no legal standing to challenge whatever I decide regarding your continued employment in this household, particularly while my brother is away and unable to intervene. Julian, sensing the danger to Nora, though not fully understanding its cause, slid off his stool and moved to stand close beside the maid, his small hand reaching for hers, with the instinctive protectiveness of a child sensing threat to someone he loved. Do not send Nora away, he said, his voice trembling but determined. Please, Aunt Beatrice, please do not. Lady Beatrice's expression softened only slightly at her nephew's evident distress, though her resolve did not waver. This is precisely the confusion I spoke of, Julian. A child should not feel such desperate attachment to a servant. It is not healthy, nor proper, and I intend to see it corrected before it does further damage to your upbringing. Claire felt something harden within her at the sight of Julian's small, frightened face, at the injustice of watching a woman, who had given years of devoted love to this family, threatened with dismissal on a manufactured technicality, simply because her care had grown deeper and more genuine than convention allowed for someone of her station. She stepped forward, positioning herself deliberately between Lady Beatrice and the frightened pair by the doorway. You will not do this, Claire said, her voice steady and clear, carrying a firmness she had not fully known she possessed until this moment demanded it of her. Not while Edmund is away, and not through some manufactured technicality about paperwork and titles. Nora has done nothing but honor a promise made to a dying woman, and I will not stand by while you punish her for showing more love to this family than convenience or propriety strictly required. You forget your place, Duchess, Lady Beatrice said sharply, though a flicker of surprise crossed her features at Claire's sudden firmness. I am the senior family member present, and matters of household staffing fall well within my authority to review, particularly when questions of impropriety have been raised. I have not forgotten my place, Claire said. I am the Duchess of this house, and whatever authority you claim while Edmund is away, I do not believe it extends to dismissing members of this household on baseless accusations, particularly not before your brother has had any opportunity to weigh in on a decision that concerns his own son so directly. The two women stared at each other across the drawing room, the tension between them thick enough that even Julian seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, pressing closer against Nora's side. For a long, uncertain moment, Claire did not know which way the confrontation would break, whether her words carried enough weight to hold against Lady Beatrice's determined resolve, or whether she had merely delayed an outcome that would arrive regardless, the moment Edmund's sister found some other avenue to pursue her purpose. It was Nora, unexpectedly, who broke the tense silence that had fallen over the drawing room. Though her voice trembled, she straightened her shoulders and spoke with a quiet dignity that Claire had not fully witnessed until this moment. My lady, I do not ask you to take my word alone. There is proof of the promise the late Duchess asked of me, if you are willing to consider it. Lady Beatrice's sharp eyes narrowed with suspicion. What proof could a maid possibly hold? Not I, Nora said. But there is a letter, in the late Duchess's own hand, kept in her private sitting room, meant for Julian when he is older. I do not know its full contents, for I have never read it, but I know it exists, because she told me herself, in her final days, that she had written it, and that it would explain to Julian, one day, all that she wished him to understand about the arrangements she had made for his care. Claire's breath caught slightly at this revelation, remembering the sealed envelope she herself had discovered in that same room, only days earlier, addressed simply to Julian, meant for a day when he was old enough to understand its contents. She had not yet mentioned its existence to anyone beyond Edmund, uncertain of the proper moment to do so. but she understood now that this was precisely the moment such proof might matter most. "I have seen this letter," Claire said, drawing Lady Beatrice's attention sharply toward herself. "I found it in Margaret's sitting room, addressed to Julian, sealed and clearly written in her own hand. I did not open it, believing it was not mine to read, but its existence alone suggests that whatever arrangement Nora describes was known to the late Duchess and considered important enough to document, however informally, before her death." Lady Beatrice's expression flickered with uncertainty for the first time since the confrontation had begun, her confidence visibly shaken by this unexpected corroboration. "A sealed letter proves nothing definite," she said, though with noticeably less conviction than before. "It could contain any manner of sentiment, unrelated to the specific arrangements you describe." "Then let us open it," Claire said, surprising herself with the boldness of the suggestion, though she recognized immediately the risk it carried. Disturbing a private communication, meant for a child not yet old enough to receive it, simply to win an argument in the present. "Not to satisfy your suspicions, Lady Beatrice, but because, if it truly documents the promise Nora describes, it may put this matter to rest permanently, and spare Julian from watching the people who love him fight over his future in this manner." Before Lady Beatrice could respond, the sound of a carriage arriving in the drive drew all their attention toward the window, and moments later, Edmund himself strode into the drawing room, his traveling coat still dusty from the road, having returned earlier than expected, when a message reached him mid-journey, informing him that matters at the distant property had resolved themselves more swiftly than anticipated. He took in the scene before him with a sharp, assessing glance. Julian pressed close against Nora's side, Lady Beatrice's stack of papers spread across the table, Claire standing firmly between them all with an expression of fierce determination he had not seen from her before. "What is happening here?" he asked, his voice carrying the sharp authority of a man returning to find his household in unexpected disarray. Lady Beatrice recovered her composure quickly, launching into an explanation of her concerns regarding Nora's undocumented position and the impropriety she believed it represented, though her words carried less certainty now than they had before Claire and Nora's revelation about the letter. Edmund listened with a growing frown, glancing occasionally toward Julian's frightened face and Nora's pale, anxious expression, before finally raising a hand to silence his sister's continued explanation. "Enough, Beatrice," he said firmly. "I appreciate your concern for this family's reputation, but I will not have my household turned upside down in my absence, over a matter I had already begun addressing myself, with far greater care than a stack of accusations gathered while I was away." "Edmund, be reasonable," Lady Beatrice pressed. "Surely you see the impropriety of the situation. A servant granted such influence over your son, without proper documentation or oversight." "I see," Edmund said slowly. "A woman who kept a promise made to a dying mother, when no one else in this household, myself included, was capable of stepping forward to fill that role. I see a child who survived the worst loss of his young life because someone chose to love him faithfully through it, rather than treating him merely as a duty to be discharged. That is not impropriety, Beatrice. That is devotion, and I will not punish it, simply because it makes for uncomfortable conversation in drawing rooms, among people who understand nothing of what this family has endured these past 2 years." Lady Beatrice's face flushed with a mixture of frustration and something closer to embarrassment, recognizing perhaps that her brother's firm stance left little room for further argument, particularly with his new wife standing so visibly united beside him on the matter, when Lady Beatrice had perhaps expected the opposite, a duchess eager to see her rival removed from the household entirely. "Very well," Lady Beatrice said stiffly, gathering her papers with brisk, wounded dignity. "I only sought to protect this family's standing, Edmund. If you choose to disregard my concerns, that is your prerogative, as head of this household. But do not say I did not warn you, should further talk arise from allowing such an arrangement to continue unchecked." "I will take that risk," Edmund said quietly, "if it means Julian continues to have someone steady and loving in his life, rather than losing yet another person he has come to depend upon." Lady Beatrice departed the drawing room without further comment, and shortly thereafter announced her intention to cut her visit short, departing Ashford Manor the following morning with considerably less warmth than she had arrived with, though Claire suspected, watching the carriage roll away down the long drive, that this would not be the last they heard of Lady Beatrice's opinions regarding the household's arrangements. But for now, the immediate threat had passed, and Claire felt a profound relief settle over her as she watched Julian finally release his tight grip on Nora's hand, his small shoulders relaxing now that the frightening confrontation had ended. Edmund knelt down to his son's level, gathering him into a rare, gentle embrace. "I am sorry, Julian," he said softly. "I should have been more attentive, these past 2 years, to what you needed, and to how much this household has come to depend on Nora's care, without proper acknowledgement or protection. That will change, I promise you." Julian nodded against his father's shoulder, though his eyes soon drifted toward Nora, still seeking the reassurance of her presence, even in this tender moment with his father. Claire, watching the scene, felt none of the old sting of exclusion she might have felt only weeks earlier. Instead, she felt something like understanding, and beneath it, a quiet resolve that the true work of building her own place in this family, not by replacing what already existed, but by adding to it, still lay ahead of her, but that the ground for it had grown considerably steadier this difficult day. In the weeks that followed Lady Beatrice's departure, a quiet shift began to take hold within Ashford Manor, subtle at first, but steady, like the slow turning of seasons. Edmund, true to his word, formalized Nora's position within the household, elevating her officially to the role of Julian's governess and companion, a title that carried proper recognition and protection, ensuring that no future relative or outsider could question her place in the family's life, on grounds of technicality ever again. Nora accepted the change with quiet gratitude, though Claire noticed she carried herself with a touch more confidence afterward, as though the formal acknowledgement had lifted a weight she had carried silently for years, the fear of a devotion that could be dismissed at any moment, simply because it had never been properly named. Claire, for her part, made a decision that surprised even herself when she first considered it, though it felt entirely right once she had settled upon it. Rather than continuing to seek moments alone with Julian, competing quietly for his attention in the way she had attempted during those first difficult weeks, she began instead to invite Nora into the activities she planned, weaving the maid's steady presence into her own efforts to grow closer to the boy, rather than treating her as an obstacle to be worked around. It began with small things, an afternoon spent teaching Julian to press flowers between the pages of a heavy book, with Nora seated nearby, offering her own gentle suggestions about which blooms would keep their color best. A rainy day spent indoors with the wooden ship puzzle Claire had first given him weeks earlier, the three of them working together to piece together its curling waves and painted sails, Julian growing increasingly animated as he explained to both women, with great seriousness, which pieces belonged where. Slowly, almost without Claire noticing the exact moment it happened, Julian began including her more naturally in his small daily rituals, no longer glancing anxiously toward Nora for permission before accepting Claire's attention, but simply allowing both women equal space in his affections, the way a child might naturally come to love more than one person, without feeling that loving one somehow betrayed the other. One afternoon, several weeks into this new rhythm, Claire found herself walking with Julian through the garden alone, Nora having remained behind to attend to some mending, and Julian reached up, without hesitation, to take Claire's hand as they walked, chattering happily about a bird's nest he had discovered in the old oak tree near the garden wall. It was such a small gesture, and yet Claire felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion at the simple, easy trust of it, so different from the wary distance he had shown her on the very first day of her arrival. "Would you like to see the nest?" Julian asked, tugging her gently toward the tree. "I would love to," Claire said, and meant it entirely. That evening, over a family dinner that had become a regular occurrence now, Julian sitting properly at the table between his father and his new mother, Edmund shared news that he had been considering carefully for some time. "I have decided," he said, glancing between Claire and his son, "that it is time we opened Margaret's letter. Julian is old enough, I believe, to hear at least a portion of what his mother wished to tell him, with our guidance and support alongside him as he receives it." Julian's small face grew solemn at this news, understanding enough of loss and memory to recognize the weight of what his father proposed, though a flicker of eager curiosity showed through his careful expression as well, the natural desire of a child who had lost his mother too young to know more of who she had truly been. They gathered in Margaret's old sitting room together that following Sunday afternoon, the dust sheets finally removed from the furniture, sunlight streaming through windows that had not been properly opened in 2 years, filling the space with warmth rather than the melancholy Claire had half expected. Nora was invited as well, a decision Edmund had made deliberately, recognizing at last how deeply woven she had become into the fabric of this family's healing, deserving of witnessing this moment alongside them, rather than waiting outside, as a servant might once have been expected to do. Edmund broke the seal carefully, and read the letter aloud, in a voice thick with emotion, Margaret's words unfolding slowly into the quiet room. She had written of her love for her son, of her fears in leaving him so young, and of the peace she had found, near the end, in trusting Nora to love him faithfully in her place. She had written, too, of her hope that Edmund would one day find happiness again, and that whoever came to share his life afterward might find it in her heart to welcome the bond between her son and the woman who had cared for him so tenderly, rather than seeing it as a rivalry to be won or lost. Claire felt tears gather in her own eyes as Edmund's voice grew unsteady reading these final words, recognizing in them an uncanny foresight, as though Margaret had somehow known, even in her final days, exactly the kind of woman her husband might one day marry, and had reached across the distance of death to offer her blessing, and perhaps a gentle guidance, toward the very outcome that had, through so much difficulty and misunderstanding, finally come to pass. Julian, listening quietly throughout, climbed into his father's lap once the reading concluded, his small face solemn but not overwhelmed, comforted rather than distressed by hearing his mother's voice, however distant, speak so clearly of her love for him. He reached out afterward, first for Nora's hand, and then, after only a moment's pause, for Claire's as well, holding both of them at once, as though understanding, in his own simple way, that his mother's letter had given him permission to love them both fully, without conflict or division. "Thank you," Claire said softly to Nora, across the small space that separated them, "for everything you have given him, and for making room, in time, for me as well." "Thank you," Nora returned, her own eyes bright with unshed tears, "for never asking me to love him less, only to share the loving of him with you." It was not a grand reconciliation, nor a dramatic turning point, marked by declarations, or promises exchanged with great ceremony. It was, instead, a quiet acknowledgement between two women who had found their way, through patience and honesty and a shared devotion to a single small boy, towards something neither had expected when Claire's carriage first rolled up the drive weeks earlier, a family built not on rivalry, but on the understanding that love, given freely and without jealousy, need never be divided to be made whole. Autumn had settled fully over Ashford Manor by the time the household hosted its next gathering. The same gardens where Julian had first run past Claire's outstretched arms, now dressed in shades of gold and amber, the air carrying the crisp scent of fallen leaves, rather than the warm bloom of summer flowers. Edmund had insisted on a smaller, quieter occasion this time, a gathering of only their closest neighbors and friends, a chance to properly celebrate the family's new rhythm, without the pressures and scrutiny that had colored their first attempt so many weeks before. Claire stood near the edge of the garden that afternoon, watching the arriving carriages roll up the long drive, when she caught sight of a familiar small figure, bursting through the manor's front doors, running down the stone steps with the same eager energy he had shown on her very first day at Ashford. Her breath caught for a brief, instinctive moment, an old wariness rising unbidden, a memory of arms that had once reached out only to be passed by. But this time, Julian did not run past her. He ran straight to her, his small legs carrying him across the gravel path with unrestrained delight, and threw his arms around her waist, with the same easy trust he might have shown any parent he had known his whole life. "Mother," he called out, the word arriving so naturally, so unguarded, that Claire felt her heart swell with an emotion too large for words. "Come see, I found another bird's nest, near the old oak, and this one has eggs in it already." Claire knelt down to his level, gathering him into a proper embrace, laughing with pure joy at the simple wonder in his voice, at the word he had used so easily, without prompting, without hesitation, as though it had always belonged to her, and he had merely been waiting for the right moment to offer it freely. "Show me," she said, taking his hand. It was only then that she noticed Nora standing a short distance away, near the garden entrance, watching the scene with a soft, unguarded smile of her own, No trace of the old wariness or careful distance that had once marked her interactions with the new Duchess. Nora caught Claire's eye and offered a small nod, an acknowledgement shared between two women who had traveled a difficult road together toward this simple, joyful moment, and who understood, without needing to speak it aloud, exactly what it had cost and what it had ultimately built. Edmund appeared beside them a moment later, having watched the entire scene unfold from the manor's front steps, his expression carrying the quiet contentment of a man who had finally found his household settled into a peace he had feared, for a long while, might never fully arrive. He came to stand beside Claire, resting a hand gently at the small of her back, and together they watched as Julian dashed ahead toward the old oak tree, Nora following close behind, to make sure he did not climb too high in his eagerness to show off the discovered nest. "He is happy," Edmund said quietly, more to himself than to Claire, though she heard the depth of relief carried in those simple words. "He is happy," Claire agreed, "because he has learned that he does not have to choose, that there is room enough in his heart, and in this house, for everyone who loves him." Edmund turned to look at her then, his expression warm with a gratitude that went beyond simple words. "I did not expect, when I brought you into this house, that you would be the one to teach me that lesson, rather than the other way around. I thought I understood my own family better than I did, but you saw what I could not, and you had the grace to act on it with kindness, rather than resentment." "I nearly did not," Claire admitted honestly. "I confess, there were days, in those first weeks, when I resented Nora deeply, when I wished only that things could be simpler, that Julian's heart held only room enough for me. It was not an easy thing, learning to share rather than compete. And yet you managed it," Edmund said, "with more grace than I think I could have shown, had our positions been reversed." They stood together a while longer, watching the small figures beneath the old oak tree, Julian pointing excitedly at the nest tucked among the branches, Nora lifting him carefully to peer closer at the delicate eggs within, both of their faces bright with the simple, uncomplicated joy that only a child's wonder could inspire in the adults fortunate enough to witness it. As the afternoon wore on and the other guests arrived, filling the garden with pleasant conversation and the clink of teacups, Claire found herself reflecting on the long path that had led to this quiet, contented moment. She thought of that very first day, the sting of watching Julian run past her outstretched arms toward someone else's embrace, the humiliation and confusion she had carried through those early weeks, uncertain of her own place in a family that seemed, at first glance, to have no room left for her. She thought, too, of everything she had learned since, of the promise made beside a dying woman's bed, of the quiet devotion that had sustained a grieving child through his darkest days, of a maid who had given more to this family than her humble position had ever required, simply because love, once given honestly, does not measure itself by title or station. She thought of Lady Beatrice's sharp accusations, and of the fierce, unexpected resolve she had found within herself to stand against them, not for her own sake, but for the sake of a woman she had once viewed as a rival, and a child they both, in their own ways, had come to love completely. The family that had formed under Ashford Manor's roof, she realized, watching Edmund laugh warmly at something Julian called out to him from beneath the oak tree, was not the family she had originally imagined when she first arrived as a hopeful bride. It was something richer, more complicated, and ultimately, more resilient than any simple picture of husband, wife, and child could have provided. It included a devoted governess who had kept a sacred promise through the hardest of circumstances. It included the quiet, patient healing of two women who had learned, through difficulty and honest conversation, to set aside rivalry in favor of a shared devotion to a child's happiness. And it included, at its center, a small boy who no longer needed to run past anyone, because he had learned, at last, that every arm reaching toward him reached out of genuine love, and that he was free to run toward all of them, without fear of choosing wrong. As the sun began its slow descent behind the garden's autumn trees, casting long golden light across the gathered family and friends, Julian came running back across the lawn, Nora close behind him, and threw himself once more into Claire's waiting arms, this time without any hesitation at all, his small face bright with the simple, complete happiness of a child who finally, fully, belonged. "Will you help me name the birds when they hatch?" he asked, breathless with excitement. "I would love nothing more," Claire said, holding him close, and meaning every word of it completely, as the golden light of that autumn afternoon settled softly over the family they had all, together, chosen to build.